Anyway, welcome everybody, both to you here at the Shine Dome and on live streaming. This conference has had a long gestation. We thought it was going to be the 2020 FENA conference, but because of COVID, it became the 2021 conference, and then because of COVID, it became the 2022 conference. So, but at least we're here now, and thank you all for coming. I know that some of you are feeling vulnerable with COVID. Some of us have had it and free to come to functions like this. I want to thank I'm the national president of Sustainable Population Australia, which won the rights to hold this conference back in 2019. Since then, we've been joined by Regenerate Earth as a co-organiser. Why, you asked, does an organisation that is primarily concerned about population run a conference on sustainable agriculture? Well, basically because Sustainable SPA, as we're known, is an environmental organisation that basically wants an ecologically sustainable population. And if you're going to have an ecologically sustainable population, you have to have ecological sustainability of the systems that support that population, not just the natural ecosystems, but also agriculture. We've always been concerned about how many people the world can support, how many people Australia can support without running down the environment. And this is what we will be discussing over the next 2 days. And the environment is certainly not coping at the moment. Will Stefan tomorrow will talk about how we've already transgressed 6 of the planetary boundaries and possibly 8. Our agricultural lands are degrading and in need of repair. Climate change threatens to undo any good work we may have done in restoring degraded landscapes. We all witnessed tons of topsoil being carried away by the floodwaters in Queensland and New South Wales in the last fortnight. Then on Tuesday, The Guardian published an article entitled "Ukraine Invasion May Lead to Worldwide Food Crisis," says the UN, warns UN. So first the bushfires, and then COVID, and then the floods, and now a war that has pushed up fuel and fertiliser prices that will affect farmers more than anyone. Hewson, we have a problem, you could say. Speakers over the next 2 days will address these problems and say how we can move onto a path towards making Australian agriculture sustainable. I have much pleasure now. If Dr. TJ Higgins is here, is he? Good. In asking him to speak, to welcome you on behalf of the Academy of Science.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm TJ Higgins. I'm a fellow of this Academy and former Vice President. I'm delighted to welcome you here today. You'll get a welcome to country in a few minutes. I'm very glad to be able to help open this conference on making Australian agriculture sustainable. This has been supported by the Academy's FENA conferences on the environment. With the generous support of the late Professor Frank Fenner and the late Mrs. Bobby Fenner, the Academy established a series of conferences focusing on the environment and conservation issues in Australia and its surrounding environments. The purpose of these conferences is to bring people together with relevant scientific, administrative, and policy expertise to consider current environmental and conservation problems, thereby contributing to policy advice that can help alleviate some of these problems. The Academy Committee that assessed the applications under the FENA conferences banner noted that There was strong support for this particular application by Sustainable Population Australia based on the national and international need for progress in this field and the unique ability of Australia to help lead the global debate. It also aligns strongly with the goals of Frank and Bobby Fenner. Many of you probably met Frank Fenner, or at least know of his work. The Australian Academy of Science holds Fenner's manuscript collection that covers the life and work of this very distinguished Australian scientist. It was added to the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Register in 2019. The Academy received a grant that enabling collaboration with the National Library of Australia to digitize Fenner's diaries, detailing work undertaken internationally between 1948 and 1999. Fenner is known for his role in international public health. He was chair of the World Health Organization Global Commission for the Certification of Smallpox Eradication, and he made many research contributions to the understanding of virology and microbiology. Frank stated that standing in front of the World Health Assembly in May 1980 and declaring smallpox gone from humanity was the proudest moment of his life. I'll just mention a little bit more about the digitized collection, which records Frank's enormous contribution to scientific research over more than 5 decades. It also is an unexpectedly rich personal archive recording Fenner's thoughts on the implications of his work, his intellectual interests, his environmental activism, which he was very active in, and contribution to the broader community. Fenner's detailed documentation of the complex challenges and resounding success of a worldwide virus investigation, its containment and vaccination program, has parallels today during the COVID pandemic, as you might agree. The digitized diaries are freely accessible via the National Library of Australia and the Academy online catalogue. But returning just briefly to the conference today, I wanted to make reference to the Academy's decadal plan, 2017 to 26, for Australian agricultural sciences. The plan notes that Australia's agriculture is important to civilization to continue into the future, yet its success has allowed it to play a largely unnoticed part in modern urban life. To the casual observer, much of agriculture may appear unchanging. Seen from a passing car, crops and grazing livestock seem almost timeless. In reality, agricultural sciences are part of a highly dynamic industry, regularly adopting recent innovations. The Australian agricultural sector has a keystone position in the structure and functioning of the country as a whole. The purpose of this decadal plan was to identify and define actions that will position Australia's agricultural sector to take advantage of major scientific and technological advances occurring over the coming decade. For instance, to realize the future that Australia is capable of, we need to enable our researchers to achieve solutions through education, career development, and retention of top-class researchers. And also, it is essential to coordinate Australian research to prioritize and stabilize its funding so that it is commensurate with the nature of the challenges that agriculture faces into the future. Many challenges. The plan lists the following priorities: a national agricultural research translation and commercialization scheme, early career researcher training led by academia, government, and industry, engagement with key infrastructure for mutual benefit, a review of the coordination of agricultural research in Australia, and efforts towards public acceptance of the role of agricultural research. And that one is very important. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I wish you Much success with your conference, and I look forward to learning of the outcomes of this important meeting. And happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you.
I apologise for not wearing green for St. Patrick's Day. I will tonight for the dinner. I want to say a bit more about Frank Fenner, after whom this conference is named. He was a patron of Sustainable Population Australia for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010 when he died. He was a lovely man. You could always depend on him for come to meetings. We loved Frank, and Frank loved us, and he is sadly missed, but his memory lives on through these conferences. I now like to introduce Shane Mortimer, who is going to do the Welcome to Conference. Incidentally, you all have a program. There are biographies of all the, short biographies of all the speakers here, so I won't take too much time in introducing Shane, but we're very happy to have him. Thank you.
Naralu pinjikul yuko namanai arabani dewara. When you cut out the water ngabi mitang. Simply, an ancient and oceanic sense of right and wrong permeates our land. The ochre ceremony this morning, the casting of the ochre, so the dust rises, then drifts and falls, is our way of uniting everybody as one to corroborate. This is corroborate. Many of you have come from as far away as Tasmania and Western Australia. And to unite everybody as one, we cast the ochre. And you'll see this ceremony performed right across Australia. How many times have you seen that iconic imagery of somebody kicking up the dust while they're dancing? And the dust flies and it drifts and it falls. And that's our way of uniting everybody as one. Because as the ochre dust rises, then drifts and falls, so too do our differences. And we're united as one. And this is a procedure that's been transmitted through the song lines for thousands and thousands of years as part of our continental common law. Our continental common law is transmitted via the song lines in the form of encoded dance and music and visual art. And that's what unites us all as one as well. So a warm welcome to you here on Ngambri country. I'm a Ngambri elder. 9 generations in a consecutive line of women connect me to this country, to this very land that you're sitting on now. Here near Sullivan's Creek, Mr. Sullivan, who murdered many of my ancestors. Thousands of our people have died on this land. And we note that we have a country that has acknowledged the genocide of our people in signing the UN Genocide Convention. And the UN Genocide Convention was then ratified in 1948. And Queen Elizabeth came to Canberra in 1954 and signed Ordinance Number 8, subtitled About Aborigines, that gave any Anglo person the right to remove any person who looked vaguely Aboriginal out of their white capital in accordance with the White Australia policy. Now, the Genocide Convention of the United Nations, Article 2, the elements of genocide, states those elements as deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction or its physical destruction in whole or in part. That's genocide. And that's what happened to my people. And the genocide continues today in the non-acknowledgement of my people in the ACT, the Ngambri people for whom Canberra is named. So I have many friends in this room today. John Hewson, Walter Jen, Ian Clark, great people, great scientists. And I see Sela Tufa has just arrived, Sela representing the Pacific Islands in Australia. Very excited to see you, please, Sela. And Jenny, congratulations on getting this conference up and going. It's been such a huge, huge problem getting this up and going, and I really appreciate what you've done. But it's very important. In this country, we have 488 million hectares of degraded Indigenous grassland, less than 1% of unaltered Indigenous grassland in this entire country. That's only happened in the last 230 years. And there is, out of all of that adversity, enormous opportunity. And the opportunity is in your hands as the leaders in this field. We have the opportunity to regenerate that grassland. Our perennial grasses that have provenance in this land, grasses like Microlinus tapoides, one of the highest protein-containing grass seeds on earth, that our people used as their dry country replacement for wheat and rice. And in this land, it grew very well, in a land where we have a 600 millimetre annual rainfall, but a 2 metre evaporation rate. That's Canberra. But yet we had food. And I encourage you to embrace the grasslands and the uses of the grasslands and the provenant nature of those grasses, because they're the easiest things to grow. So a 5% increase of soil organic matter in the degraded Indigenous grasslands of this country will take more carbon out of the atmosphere than the entire planet's put up there since the Industrial Revolution. There is your opportunity. There is your future. It's a massive future that will create more employment in Australia than we have unemployed. We'll have to pull people in from other countries to come here, just like Australia did to build the Snowy Hydro scheme. We'll have extraordinary opportunity here. So I implore that you embrace the grasslands, the provenance of those species that were here and can be restored. Look at the mycelium. The mycelium is your future. The wood wide web is, as it's referred to by Professor Merlin Sheldrake, the wood wide web of mycelium that makes everything grow. Our future is in mycelium in terms of sustainable agriculture because of its abundance of nutrient, and it's serving to replace meats and other things, leathers. These days, extraordinary things are being made from mycelium, including handbags. I don't know whether we managed to get that up there, we didn't, but there's a company that's called Hermes in Paris. It's making handbags from mycelium, $8,000 for a beautiful French handbag, but that's the future. If they can produce something as fine as that, imagine the future for mycelium. Imagine your car having mycelium seats. So I'd like to firstly say happy St. Patrick's Day. So I think that's really important. And remind you that the British never defeated the Gael. And it's the same for First People in this land. Enjoy your conference.
Thank you, Shane. Our next speaker, who will open the conference, needs no introduction, I'm sure. We're very grateful to Professor John Hewson for coming today. He was the former Liberal leader. In recent years, he's been an academic and an author, and I'm particularly grateful to him for his climate change action, which has been critical in moving that particular fight along. You'll find his biography here and more on the website. But John has actually had some illness. So we're grateful to him for sort of making the effort to come today. So welcome, John Hewson. I invite you to speak.
Good morning. One of those people who actually believes that masks and vaccinations are important. It's an honour to be asked and a pleasure to be here to open this conference, very important conference, but also it's an embarrassment. And as an ex-Liberal leader, I look at how far we've slid in terms of the standing of the government on the issue of climate change generally, and specifically the opportunities in areas like regenerative agriculture. I want to begin by acknowledging the country, acknowledging elders, past, present and emerging, paying our respects, and say that I think we've got a lot of challenges in this country, but it is embarrassing that we've taken over 200 years to actually address the issue of proper recognition of our Indigenous heritage of the first Australians. There's so much in this sort of conference that we can learn from Indigenous practices, and it is embarrassing that that is not seen as a major overriding challenge for the next, for the current and next governments. On climate change, as I said, I was embarrassed. We were quite active on the issue in the late 80s and early 90s in the Liberal Party. We're calling for a 20% cut in emissions by the year 2000 off a 1990 base. And I stop and think of how much further advanced we would be as a nation with improved global standing if we'd actually done that each decade since then. We'd be so far ahead of the Paris objectives, it wouldn't matter. But for some reason, it's become a very politicised issue that is more the focus of point scoring one side against the other than it is recognising the responsibilities of government in this respect. The focus today should be on transition, should be looking sector by sector what needs to be done to get to net zero or to get to a low carbon Australia by mid-century. And it seems that almost every day goes by, we seem to slide back further from that objective. We've had pointless debates about whether it should be net zero and whether we need a 2030 target consistent with a net zero target by 2050. And even this morning, I see a report of the government in handing out disaster relief to the shires of Byron and Ballina and Tweed, that there's a overarching political dimension to that allocation, so much so that one of the members of the upper house in New South Wales has resigned, Catherine Cusack, in protest over the politicisation of disaster relief. That's about as low as I think you can go in a world where you haven't faced your responsibilities as a government in terms of preparing adequately for floods and other natural disasters. I was struck this week by the press statement by the Emerging Leaders for Climate Action, which is a group of 37 ex-commissioners, fire commissioners and disaster recovery commissioners, who called on the who pointed to emphasise the bungling of the government in terms of the management of the floods, that they ignored the warnings, the response was inadequate, and as they said, I think, quote them, those who do hold a hose know just how dangerous climate change has become. Australia is underprepared, and Canberra has no answers to how it will significantly reduce emissions this decade. Their frustration in terms of the handling of natural disasters is very significant. And these are people who know what they're talking about. And the government, Morrison, refused to meet them at the time of the Black Summer bushfires and has refused to speak with them, I gather, on this occasion in relation to floods. But they made the point that there's no more manageable hazard in Australia than floods. We know when it will be over, so we know when it will occur. Usually warnings are ahead of it, and we can predict what the effects will be. So there's no excuse for not managing it properly. And I think this failure by the government to admit to any link between climate change and natural disasters is the essence of the issue, that they are not prepared to acknowledge that link, which they believe gives them a political edge, which is a sad commentary on how far politics has slid in this country and lost sight of the need to lead in these circumstances and to be empathetic as to the plight of those who are victims of these natural disasters. Just paying some attention to climate science, recognising that the prediction of more extreme weather events occurring with greater frequency and intensity or severity should be enough to actually motivate a government to put in place a proper framework within which we can look at issues like regenerative agriculture. As I said, the focus today should be on transition, sector by sector. We should be looking at what needs to be done in the power sector to complete the transition to renewables, in the transport sector, electrification or alternative fuel sources for and transition away from fossil fuels, and in agriculture, which, I mean, the basic point is Australia is one of the most exposed to climate change, and we have the opportunity, greater opportunities than most other countries from an effective response and transition. And agriculture is fundamentally important to that. Yet one of the partners in the coalition, the National Party, has spent a lot of time in the last couple of years trying to exclude agriculture from considerations of a response to climate change, which is really hard to understand given the significance of the opportunity in regenerative agriculture, improving the carbon content of our soils, making them more resistant to drought and more resilient. It is staggering ignorance. This conference is very important, focusing on the need for sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. And it is surprising that it is not recognised that agriculture can be net negative in terms of emissions. It can make a very significant contribution to the transition that's required to a low carbon Australia by the middle part of the century. We're not asking, I think many farmers are already aware of already doing some of the things that are required for regenerative agriculture to improve the carbon content of their soil. Simple changes in farming techniques, shallow tilling, moving away from chemical fertilisers to organic fertilisers, rotating animals and crops, and a whole host of other elements to a successful transition strategy in agriculture. And what I couldn't understand is that it's an opportunity for farmers to generate carbon credits, which is another income stream to farmers who struggle in times of extreme weather events. And government have to put their hand out to government for some sort of welfare assistance. This would be an alternative to that. The potential for agriculture is enormous, and yet half the government wants to leave it out of any consideration of an effective transition to a low carbon Australia in the next 30, 40 years. So this conference is very important in that respect. The elements that are being addressed in different sessions are going to look at the various issues around creating sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. But we do need a political framework. We do need governments to recognise their responsibilities and to provide the leadership that the average voter expects them to provide in these sort of extreme circumstances, which, after all, why they voted in. That's the job they're expected to do. But I can't understand why, in the time since we were active in the late 80s, early 90s on climate, There's only been one other occasion where you had what you'd call more or less bipartisan support for its decisive response to climate change. That was in 2007. John Howard got very worried about losing to Kevin Rudd, who'd made quite a lot of headway in terms of the issue. So he committed also to an emissions trading scheme, which that commitment didn't last long in the Liberal Party because Abbott saw it as a mechanism by which to destroy the Gillard-Rudd governments, opposing a carbon price. The hypocrisy of that was staggering because he's the alternative of an emissions reduction fund, which paid for emissions reduction, actually put a price on carbon. So I've always found that a bizarre set of circumstances. And the problem was that Abbott actually believed that he won government on the basis of the opposition to carbon price and immediately dismantled the structure around it and set us back a long way in terms of where we should be today. If we just left the Gillard carbon price in place and had transitioned that to be a more market-based price, I think we would be well ahead of our Paris commitments already. These are simple statements to make, but it's very difficult to push them through the political process, which is not interested in recognising there are any responsibilities in this respect. In the last week, we've seen the government actually take to court and oppose the idea that it has a duty of care to future generations in relation to climate, as it does in a lot of other areas. That is a very sad comment on how poor the attitudes are in this country. So I'm pleased to open this conference against the background of those sort of comments and encourage very active participation in what is a very important subject and will be one of the defining characteristics of Australia. I hear a lot from the Prime Minister how we're leading on everything. We're leading in terms of our response to the pandemic. We're leading the world in terms of most of its exaggerated hubris, but this is an area where we can lead. Regenerative agriculture, we can demonstrate to the world the potential of regenerative agriculture. And I hear them say they don't like to go to international conferences without something substantive to contribute. And they've been hesitant to commit to targets or policies that will achieve low carbon Australia. But here's an area where we can actually set an example, globally set an example. And it is really quite surprising that in this sort of set of these global circumstances of massive uncertainty, that we aren't playing that leadership role that we could in relation to response to climate change. As I say, we are the most exposed, one of the most exposed nations in the world to climate, yet we have the greatest opportunities of most nations to benefit from that in terms of, as we've heard this morning, activity and jobs and growth, everywhere in terms of a sensible response. So I suggest that we make a lot of noise out of this conference, and hopefully some of it will filter into what will be the election in May. It's hard to make any of these issues an election issue. And the government wants to focus on issues like national security. But of course, the hypocrisy of that is staggering, given that I think this most significant national security issue is in fact climate change. And we have a national security strategy without a reference to climate change. It boggles the mind. I think they should pay attention to those emergency leaders for climate action who have said that the recent floods are echoes of the Black Summer fires. The same modus operandi of the government in both cases, with not a very effective response. So I wish this conference well, and some very, very good speakers and good array of subjects to demonstrate the potential of regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture in this country. Thank you.